There is a door standing open right now that most people will walk past without ever noticing it. Not because it is hidden, not because it is far away, but because they are moving too fast, thinking too loud, and looking in every direction except the one that matters. I am going to show you exactly where that door is. I am going to show you the 8 things that quietly keep people from walking through it. And by the time this message is finished, you are going to know exactly what to do in the next 30 days to make sure you are not one of the people who walked right past their own breakthrough without even realizing it was there. Stay with me through this. I promise you, this is not a message you want to leave halfway through, because the part that changes everything is not at the beginning. It is buried in the middle, where most people stop paying attention. And it is waiting for you at the end, where most people have already given up. Here is what I have learned after more than 30 years of standing in front of people who were hurting, hoping, waiting, and wondering if anything was ever going to change for them. Breakthrough is not random, it is not luck. It is not something that happens to some people and skips others by accident, the way it so often feels when you are the one still waiting. Breakthrough follows a pattern. It always has. And once you understand that pattern, you stop waiting for good things to happen to you, and you start positioning yourself to receive them on purpose. I call these the 8 keys. Some of you watching this are about to recognize exactly why the last 2 years of your life have felt stuck in the exact same place, no matter how hard you have tried to move forward. Some of you are about to understand, maybe for the first time, why every time you get close to something good, it slips through your fingers at the very last moment. And some of you are already standing closer to your breakthrough than you realize. You are not far away at all. You just have not picked up the key that has been sitting right in front of you this entire time. Let's begin with the first one, because if you miss this one, everything else on this list gets a great deal harder to hold on to. Most people think big changes announce themselves with noise, a dramatic moment, a crisis, a collapse, something loud enough that you cannot possibly miss it. But that is rarely how it actually works. And if you have lived long enough, you already know this in your bones, even if you have never said it out loud. The truth is this: before anything big falls apart and before anything big comes together, there is almost always a quiet signal first, a feeling, a hesitation, a thought that shows up uninvited and simply will not leave you alone no matter how many times you try to push it aside. Most people miss their breakthrough not because the signal never came. It came. It always comes. They miss it because they were too busy, too distracted, or too tired to notice it when it did, and by the time they finally looked up, the moment had already quietly passed them by. I want you to think back for a moment. Has there been a small voice inside you lately? A nudge, a hunch, a flash of clarity that came and went before you could even act on it? Maybe it told you to walk away from something you have been holding on to out of habit rather than love. Maybe it told you to finally start the thing you have been putting off for years. The thing you tell people about at dinner parties as a someday plan instead of a real decision. Maybe it told you that the way you have been doing things simply is not working anymore. And somewhere deep down, you already knew that. But you pushed the thought away because acting on it felt inconvenient or frightening, or like far too much work for a season of your life when you were already exhausted. Here is what I have watched happen again and again, in life after life, over more years than I can count. The signal rarely repeats itself in exactly the same way twice. It gets fainter each time you ignore it. Not because it disappears completely, but because you get better and better at drowning it out. You fill the silence with noise. Scrolling, distraction, busyness dressed up as productivity. You keep your hands and your mind so full that there is simply no room left for the very thing that was trying, gently, patiently, to guide you somewhere better than where you currently stand. I remember a season in my own life when everything on paper looked completely fine. Steady work, steady routine, nothing visibly wrong with any part of it, but something inside me kept insisting, quietly and persistently, that a change was coming whether I planned for it or not. I ignored that feeling for months. I told myself I was being paranoid or dramatic or simply overthinking a perfectly stable situation the way people sometimes do when they are bored or restless. Then the change came anyway, exactly as that quiet voice had been trying to tell me it would. Except this time, because I had not prepared for it, it hit me sideways instead of finding me ready. It cost me something it did not need to cost me, and the only reason it cost me anything at all was that I had spent months refusing to listen to what I already knew. That is the real cost of not listening. It is not that life punishes you for missing the signal, the way some people imagine some cosmic scorekeeper working against them. It is simply that you walk into the next chapter of your life unprepared instead of ready. And unprepared always costs more than ready does, in time, in energy, in peace of mind you did not have to lose. So here is your first key, and I want you to actually do this, not simply hear it and move on the way you have moved on from 100 other pieces of advice before this one. At some point today, sit in complete silence for 10 uninterrupted minutes. No phone within reach, no music playing in the background, no noise of any kind competing for your attention. Just ask yourself one honest question. What have I been avoiding hearing lately? And then let the answer surface in its own time without rushing it or arguing with it the moment it appears.
You already know more than you are giving yourself credit for. You always have.
You simply have not made the room to actually listen to it. Now here is something I have noticed after decades of watching people try to transform their lives. Something that shows up so consistently across every single kind of person I have ever worked with that I no longer consider it a coincidence. Almost everyone plans to change later. Later, when things calm down. Later, when the timing is finally right. Later, when they have more energy, more money, more certainty about how it will all turn out. But later rarely arrives the way we imagine it will, while we are sitting there picturing it. And the version of you who is finally ready almost never shows up exactly on schedule the way you are hoping. Because readiness was never something you were meant to wait for in the first place. It is something you decide on an ordinary day, long before you feel fully prepared for it. I have sat across from so many people over the years who told me with complete and total sincerity that they were going to fix the relationship, start the business, leave the situation that was quietly draining the life out of them, or finally take their health seriously, just not yet. And years later, some of those exact same people were still saying the exact same sentence, word for word, as though no time had passed at all. Not because they did not care about their own lives, not because they lacked the ability to change, but because later is a remarkably comfortable place to hide from a decision that actually requires something real from you right now, today, in this very moment while you are watching this. I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to actually answer it, rather than letting the question drift past the way you have let 100 other questions drift past before it. What is the thing you have been telling yourself you will deal with eventually? Is it a conversation you already know, deep down, that you need to have with someone? Is it a habit you already know is not serving the person you are trying to become? Is it a decision you have been quietly circling for months without ever actually landing on it, turning it over and over in your mind without letting yourself commit either way? The version of your life you have been hoping for does not begin on the day everything finally feels perfectly aligned. It never has for anyone in the entire history of anyone changing their life for the better. It begins on the ordinary day. You stop waiting for alignment and start moving forward anyway, imperfectly, uncertainly, but forward. Today is that day, not next Monday, not after the holidays, not once things settle down, because things have a way of never fully settling down. Today, now I want to tell you something that changed the entire trajectory of how I think about the seasons when people feel completely stuck. Something that took me years longer to understand than I would like to admit. Fear is not simply a feeling that happens to you, arriving and departing on its own schedule while you stand there passively experiencing it. Fear is something you can unknowingly agree with, and every single time you agree with it, even quietly, even without meaning to, you hand it a little more power over the decisions you make going forward. Think about how this actually works in practice. Fear whispers something. This will not work. You will fail at this. You are not ready for this yet. It is far too risky right now. And if you nod along with that whisper, if you repeat it back to yourself later as though it were simply the truth, if you let it slowly become the story you tell other people about why you have not moved forward with the thing you actually want, then you have entered into an agreement with it, whether you meant to or not. And that agreement, once made, becomes a wall that is far harder to see than it is to feel. I have watched brilliant, capable, deeply talented people stay stuck for years at a time, not because they lacked the ability to move forward, but because they had unconsciously signed a contract with their own fear a long time ago. And they kept quietly renewing that contract every single day without ever realizing that renewal was even happening. Here is the part almost everyone misses about how fear actually operates. It rarely shows up loud or dramatic. It shows up quiet, reasonable, almost practical sounding, which is exactly what makes it so persuasive. It does not scream at you not to do something. It whispers gently and patiently, just wait a little longer. Just be a little more careful. Just make absolutely sure everything is perfect before you take the first step. And because it sounds so sensible, so measured, so responsible, we end up listening to it far more often than we would ever listen to something that sounded obviously irrational or extreme. I remember standing at the edge of one of the biggest decisions of my entire life, and every practical, well-meaning voice around me was counseling caution, urging me to slow down, to reconsider, to wait for a better moment, not because any of them wished me harm. Fear is contagious in exactly the way warmth or laughter is contagious, and it spreads through the people closest to us just as easily as it spreads through our own private thoughts late at night. I had to make a choice in that moment that I still think about to this day. Agree with the fear filling the room around me, or agree instead with the version of my own future that I actually wanted for myself. I chose the second one. It did not feel comfortable in the moment, and it rarely does feel comfortable, no matter how many times you make that same choice over the course of a lifetime. But comfort was never actually the goal, no matter how much it disguises itself as one. Growth was always the goal, and growth and comfort have never lived very well in the same room together. Here is your assignment for this particular key, and I want you to genuinely do it rather than simply nod along and keep scrolling. Say this out loud, right now, wherever you happen to be sitting or standing while you listen to this. I break my agreement with fear. It is going to feel strange to say out loud, especially if you are in a public place or somewhere someone might hear you. Say it anyway, quietly if you need to, but say it with your actual voice rather than just thinking it. Every agreement can be broken the exact same way it was originally made, through a decision, spoken clearly, and repeated consistently until it finally becomes true in the way that all real, lasting change eventually becomes true. I want you to consider something now that most people never once stop to think about carefully, even though it is quietly shaping the entire direction of their lives every single day. Distraction rarely arrives looking dangerous. It never introduces itself honestly as the very thing that is slowly, quietly costing you your future one small piece at a time. It shows up disguised as something completely ordinary. An extra hour spent scrolling that you never intended to spend. A conversation that leaves you feeling drained for the rest of the day without you quite understanding why. A low-grade argument that occupies far more of your mental space than the actual issue ever deserved. The constant low hum of other people's opinions about how you should be living your own life. Opinions you never actually asked for in the first place. And distraction is remarkably patient. More patient than almost anything else working against you. It does not need to stop your progress all at once in one dramatic moment you would easily notice and resist. It only needs to steal small pieces of your attention, day after day after day. until months have quietly passed, and you look up one ordinary afternoon and realize, with a kind of quiet shock, that you are standing in the exact same place you were standing a full year ago. Busy the entire time, occupied every single day, and yet somehow no closer to where you actually wanted to be than you were when the year began. There is an old story about two people living in the same house on the very same afternoon. One of them was constantly busy, running from task to task, anxious and visibly overwhelmed by everything demanding her attention all at once. The other chose in that same moment to sit still and give her full, undivided focus to the one thing in the room that actually mattered right then. The busy one was not wrong to work hard. Hard work is never the problem on its own. But she had quietly confused motion with actual progress, the way so many of us do without ever noticing the difference. And in doing so, she nearly missed the very thing she had been working so hard to protect and provide for in the first place. I think about this constantly when I look back on my own life. There were seasons early in my career when I was so consumed with activity, meetings, obligations, other people's expectations pressing in on me from every direction, that I very nearly lost touch with the actual vision I had started out with in the first place. I had to relearn something the hard way, the way most important lessons end up being learned. Not everything that demands your attention actually deserves it, no matter how urgent it feels in the moment it is demanding it. Some things are simply weights rather than sins. Not bad things exactly, not things you need to feel guilty about, just heavy things that quietly slow you down if you carry them for too long without ever setting a single one of them aside. I want to give you one more picture of this before we move on, because I think it explains why guarding your attention matters more than almost anything else on this entire list. Imagine two people planting the exact same seed on the exact same day, in the exact same soil, under the exact same sky. One of them checks on it constantly, pulling it up every few days to inspect the roots, moving it from spot to spot, looking for slightly better light, second-guessing the placement over and over again. The other plants it once, waters it consistently, and then simply leaves it alone to do what seeds have always known how to do without any interference at all. You already know without me telling you which one grows stronger. Distraction does not just steal time, it disturbs the roots of whatever you are quietly trying to grow, again and again, before it has ever had the chance to take hold. So here is what I want you to do with this particular key. Look honestly, really honestly, at where your attention actually went over the last 7 days. Not where you meant for it to go while you were making your plans and your resolutions. Where it actually went, hour by hour, if you are willing to be that honest with yourself. And then ask yourself plainly which parts of that were genuinely building the life you say you want, and which parts were simply noise wearing a very convincing disguise. Then make exactly one deliberate change this week, not 10 changes all at once, the way most people try and fail to overhaul their entire life in a single weekend. 1. Consistency will always beat intensity in the long run. Every single time, no matter how much intensity appeals to us in the moment we decide to finally change. Before we move to the next key, I want to give you something practical to hold on to, because I know some of you are the kind of person who needs more than a feeling in order to actually change your behavior. You need something concrete. So here is what breaking an agreement with fear actually looks like in ordinary, everyday practice, not in some dramatic movie moment, but in the small decisions that make up an actual week. It looks like sending the message you have been drafting and deleting for 3 days, exactly as it was, without softening it into something safer that no longer says what you actually mean. It looks like applying for the thing you have quietly decided you are probably not qualified for, before you have talked yourself out of even trying. It looks like having the conversation you have been rehearsing in the shower for weeks, out loud with the actual person, instead of only ever having it in your own head, where it costs you nothing and changes nothing. Fear loses almost all of its power the moment you act in spite of it, rather than waiting for it to leave first. It was never going to leave first. It only ever leaves after you have already moved. Talk is not the problem, and I want to be clear about that before we go any further. Because almost everyone talks about the change they want to make in their life. Nearly every person I have ever sat down with could describe their dream life to me in vivid, specific detail if I simply asked them to. The real problem is the gap, the actual space that exists between what someone says they want out loud and what they are genuinely willing to do about it once the conversation ends and the ordinary demands of daily life resume. I have heard people describe their dream life in extraordinary, almost cinematic detail. The business, the relationship, the health, the freedom they are chasing, and then, in the very next breath, describe in equally vivid detail exactly why none of it is possible for them right now. That gap is not circumstantial, even though it always feels that way from the inside. It is a decision, even if it rarely feels like a decision while you are living inside of it day after day. Every single day that gap stays open is a day you are quietly choosing comfort over commitment, even if you would never phrase it to yourself in those exact words. Here is what I have observed after watching thousands of people try in every possible way to change their lives for the better. The ones who actually transform are rarely the most naturally talented, the most well-connected, or the most obviously gifted people in the room. They are, almost without exception, the ones who close the gap between their words and their actions faster than everyone else around them, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was deeply inconvenient, even when nobody in their life fully understood why they were doing what they were doing. Commitment shows up almost entirely in the boring, unglamorous, repeated choices that nobody ever claps for and nobody ever posts about. It is the early morning nobody else sees you wake up for, the difficult conversation nobody else witnesses you having, the discipline you maintain on the exact days when motivation has completely and totally disappeared. That is where real, lasting change actually gets built, brick by brick. Not in the announcement of the goal at the dinner table or in the caption of a photo, but in the thousand small actions that quietly follow that announcement when nobody is watching and no one would ever know if you simply quietly gave up. I want to ask you plainly, and I want you to sit with this rather than rushing past it the way you might rush past an uncomfortable question. Where is the gap in your own life right now, today, as you are listening to this? What is it that you have said out loud to yourself or to someone else that your actions have not actually caught up to yet? Do not answer that too quickly. Sit with it for a moment. And then pick exactly one action today, just one, that closes that particular gap by even a single inch. Momentum has never once required a giant leap from anyone. It only ever requires a direction, taken consistently, one small step after another. There is a principle I have taught for years now that fundamentally changes the way people think about waiting for their breakthrough to finally arrive. Most people wait for the breakthrough itself to show up before they ever start preparing for it. But the people who actually receive breakthrough, in my long experience of watching this play out again and again, almost always prepared for it before there was any visible evidence whatsoever that it was actually coming their way. There is an old story of an army dying of thirst in the middle of a dry desert valley, being instructed to dig ditches throughout that same valley with no rain in sight anywhere on the horizon and not a single cloud overhead. It made no logical sense to anyone standing there with a shovel in their hands. And yet, according to the story, the very next morning, water came from an unexpected direction and filled every single ditch that had been dug the night before, while the surrounding land remained completely dry and untouched. That story has always stayed with me because of exactly what it reveals about how preparation actually works. Preparation is, in its own way, a form of faith. It is the decision to build the container before you can see with your own eyes what is eventually going to fill it. Most people want the harvest, understandably, but they have never once actually picked up a shovel to prepare the ground for it. They want the breakthrough, badly, sincerely, but they have not made a single meaningful change in their own life that would actually make room for it to land safely once it finally arrives. I want to ask you something a little uncomfortable now, something worth sitting with honestly, rather than answering too quickly out of pride. If the very thing you have been hoping for showed up in your life tomorrow morning, would your life actually be ready to receive it the way you imagine it would be? If the opportunity arrived unexpectedly, do you already have the skills built up over time to actually take hold of it and run with it? If the relationship healed overnight, have you done the quiet inner work required to actually show up differently inside of it than you did before? If the money arrived all at once, have you already built the habits that would let you keep it and grow it, rather than watching it slip right back out through the exact same patterns that have always been there underneath the surface? Do not wait for the rain to fall before you start digging. Dig now, today, while the sky above you is still completely clear. Prepare now. Build a version of yourself today that will actually be ready to receive what you have been asking for tomorrow. No one transforms their life in complete isolation, not really, no matter how independent or self-reliant they like to believe themselves to be. Every powerful season of growth I have ever personally witnessed in someone else's life had this one thing in common. The person surrounded themselves, even in small, quiet ways, with people who reinforced the direction they were trying to move in, instead of people who, often without even meaning to, kept quietly pulling them back toward who they used to be. This is not about cutting everyone difficult out of your life or becoming isolated in the name of ambition, the way some motivational messages seem to suggest. It's about being genuinely honest with yourself about which relationships in your life are actively feeding your growth, and which ones, however well-intentioned, are quietly feeding your doubt instead. Some people in your life will celebrate the version of you that is changing right in front of them. Others, even without consciously meaning to, will feel subtly threatened by it, because your growth quietly asks a question of them that they are not yet ready or willing to answer honestly for themselves. I have watched entire families transform once a single person inside that family decided to bring everyone else into the vision, instead of trying to carry the entire weight of it alone in silence. A shift in one person's discipline, spoken about openly at the dinner table instead of hidden away out of embarrassment, has a remarkable way of quietly giving everyone else around them permission to want more for themselves too. So here's the key for this part of the message. Identify exactly one person this week who you can be genuinely honest with about what you are actually working toward right now. Not for their approval, which you do not actually need in order to move forward. For real accountability instead. Growth that is shared out loud with even one other person is far, far harder to quietly abandon in a moment of weakness than growth that has been kept entirely secret. We began this message talking about a door standing open, one that most people walk right past without ever noticing it is even there. I want to bring you back to that image now, because this is where everything we have talked about today finally comes together into one single point. There is an old story of a wedding where 10 people were waiting through the night for the arrival of the groom, 5 of whom had prepared enough oil to keep their lamps burning through the entire night, and 5 of whom had not thought that far ahead. When the moment finally arrived, in the middle of the night, without warning, the 5 who were ready walked straight through the door without a single moment of hesitation. The 5 who were not ready were left standing outside in the dark, and by the time they had scrambled to get themselves prepared, the door had already quietly closed behind everyone else. That story was never really about oil or lamps, not underneath the surface of it. It has always been about the simple, uncomfortable fact that readiness has a window attached to it, not an unlimited runway stretching endlessly out in front of you. Doors do not stay open forever, no matter how much we might wish they would. Opportunities do not wait indefinitely for us to finally feel emotionally prepared enough to walk through them. At some point, the moment arrives on its own schedule, not on yours, and it either finds you ready or it does not. And there is very little room for negotiation once that moment actually appears. I have watched people spend years circling their own breakthrough, close enough the entire time to actually see it clearly, but never quite close enough to walk all the way through it, because they kept waiting for a feeling of complete certainty that was simply never going to arrive before the door opened. Only afterward, once they had already found the courage to step through it. You do not need certainty in order to walk through the door standing in front of you right now. You need willingness instead. Certainty has never once been something you are handed before you take the first step. It is something you build for yourself, one step at a time, by actually walking. I know what some of you are thinking right now, because I have heard this same objection more times than I could ever count over the years. You are thinking, this all sounds good in theory, but you do not know my situation. You do not know what I am actually carrying right now. You do not know how many times I have already tried to change and quietly failed. How many resolutions I have already broken. How many fresh starts have already fizzled out somewhere around week 3. And you are right. I do not know the specific details of your situation, but I want to tell you something I have learned from sitting across from thousands of people over the years who all said some version of that exact same thing to me before their lives actually changed. The fact that you have failed before is not evidence that you cannot succeed now. It is evidence that you are the kind of person who keeps trying, which, whether you can see it clearly from where you are standing today or not, is exactly the kind of person breakthrough eventually finds. The people who never change are not the ones who tried and failed. They are the ones who stopped trying entirely. And if you are still here, still listening, still asking the question of how to move forward, you have not stopped. That matters more than you are currently giving yourself credit for. Let me pause here for a moment, because we are past the halfway point of this message now. And I want to make sure you are still fully present with me, not just letting this play quietly in the background while your attention has already wandered somewhere else. What we have covered so far, hearing the quiet signal, refusing to schedule your own change for some later date that may never come, breaking your agreement with fear, guarding your attention, closing the gap between your words and your actions. That is the foundation. That is the groundwork. But what comes next is where most people quietly check out. Right at the exact moment the message is about to become the most useful to them. And I do not want that to be you today. So take a breath, refocus if you need to, and stay with me. Because the next part is where preparation turns into something you can actually hold on to. There is something else I want to say about preparation before we move forward. Something I have rarely heard anyone else say clearly, even though I believe it might be the single most overlooked part of this entire process. Preparation is not just about skills or habits or ditches dug in a dry valley. It is also about your own internal expectation of yourself. I have met people who did every single practical thing right, who built the habits, who showed up consistently, who did the work day after day, and still stayed stuck because somewhere underneath all of that effort, they had never actually updated their own private expectation of who they were allowed to become. You can dig every ditch in the valley and still secretly expect the sky to stay dry. And if that is the quiet expectation running underneath everything you do, it will eventually undercut even your best efforts. One small act of self-sabotage at a time, so subtle you might not even notice it happening. I remember working with someone many years ago who had done everything right on paper, every habit in place, every practical step taken exactly as advised. And yet every single time real opportunity came close, something would happen, almost as if on cue, that quietly pushed it back out of reach again. It took a long time before we finally identified what was actually going on underneath the surface. This person had grown up being told, directly and indirectly in 100 small ways over the course of an entire childhood, that people like them did not get the big things in life. Not because anyone said it cruelly. Sometimes it is said gently, even lovingly, out of a desire to protect someone from disappointment. But the message lands the same way regardless of the tone it arrives in, and it quietly shapes what a person believes they are allowed to receive long after the person who said it has been forgotten entirely. If any part of what I just described sounds familiar to you, I want you to hear this clearly. Whatever old expectation was placed on you, by circumstance, by other people, by a version of yourself that existed a long time ago and simply did not know any better yet, that expectation is not a life sentence. It was accurate once, perhaps, given the information available to you at the time. It does not have to remain accurate going forward. You are allowed to update it, not with empty positive thinking that ignores reality, but with the same quiet, deliberate decision we have talked about throughout this entire message. A decision spoken clearly, repeated consistently, until it becomes true, the way all real change eventually becomes true. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we bring this all the way home, and it might be the most important thing in this entire message, even though it is the simplest. None of these 8 keys work as a single burst of motivation that fades by tomorrow afternoon, the way most motivational content tends to fade once the video ends and ordinary life resumes. They work as a practice, a repeated, unglamorous, sometimes boring practice that you return to again and again. Especially on the days when you do not feel like it at all. Especially on the days when nothing seems to be visibly changing, no matter how consistent you have been. I have watched people give up in the exact week before their breakthrough was scheduled to arrive. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because they mistook a season of quiet, invisible growth for a season of failure. Simply because nothing dramatic had happened yet that they could point to and feel proud of. Growth is almost always invisible right up until the moment it suddenly is not. Think of anything that grows slowly and steadily over time, and you will notice the same pattern every time you look closely enough. Nothing appears to be happening for what feels like an unbearably long stretch of time, and then seemingly overnight everything changes all at once in a way that looks sudden from the outside, but was actually the direct result of everything that came quietly before it. If you are in that invisible stretch right now, the part where nothing seems to be visibly changing no matter what you do, I want you to hear this clearly. That is not evidence that nothing is happening. That is simply what growth looks like from the inside before it becomes visible from the outside. Do not quit in the exact season where quitting costs you the most. We started this message talking about a door standing open right now, one that most people walk past every single day without ever once noticing it. You now know, if you have stayed with me this far, exactly what has been quietly standing between you and that door for longer than you probably realized. Not because you lacked the ability to walk through it. You have always had that ability. But because somewhere along the way, distraction, fear, delay, or simply a lack of preparation quietly built a wall directly in front of it, brick by brick, without you fully realizing that the wall was even being built in the first place. Here is what I want you to do the very moment this message ends. Do not simply nod along in agreement and move straight on to the next thing waiting for your attention, the way you have moved on from 100 other pieces of advice before this one. Pick exactly one key, just one, out of everything we walked through together today, the one that hit you the hardest as you were listening. Write it down somewhere you'll actually see it again later today, not somewhere it will disappear the moment you close this. And take one small concrete action on it before the day is over. Not tomorrow, not once you have had more time to think it over. Today, while everything we just talked about is still fresh enough to move you. I want to say one final thing before you go. Something I have said to close nearly every message I have ever delivered, because I have never found a truer way to end than this. None of this was ever really about 8 keys or a door or a valley full of ditches waiting for rain. It was about you deciding on an entirely ordinary day like today that the story you have been quietly telling yourself about who you are and what you are capable of is no longer the final word on the matter. You get to write the next chapter starting now, not starting someday, not starting once conditions improve, but starting the moment you close this message and carry even one of these 8 keys into the rest of your actual day. I have watched enough lives change over enough years to know that the turning point rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. It usually looks exactly like this: an ordinary person on an ordinary day deciding to do one small thing differently than they did it yesterday. That is all a turning point has ever needed to look like. That is all it needs to look like for you, starting right now. If any part of this message meant something real to you, tell me in the comments below which of the 8 keys you are choosing to start with first. Someone else scrolling past today in the exact same stuck place you were in not long ago needs to see your answer more than you probably realize. And if you want to keep building this together, stay close, because there is more coming, and I genuinely do not want you to miss a single part of it. The door is open right now, exactly as it was when we started. Walk through it.